In the summer of 2008, Russia was at war with America's ally, Georgia.
Значит, нужно было просто остановить агрессию, которую развязал Саакашвили. Более того, я не судья и не палач.
But little stood between Russia's army and Georgia's capital.
Россия, разумеется, доведет до логического завершения свою миротворческую миссию.
Georgia's president, Mikhail Saakashvili, told President Bush that the fate of the world was being decided in his small country. America must send military help.
I told him, look, right now, on your watch, you might see the reversal, basically the demise of Soviet Union. It might be restored right now in my country, and it would be a very tragic turn of history for us, certainly. For us it would be the end, but certainly for the US and for the world.
In the White House, Bush's team weighed their options.
It was a delicate situation. The Russians had attacked our ally, the Georgians. To see the Russians beat up on a small country was really unpalatable for us.
There was a clear feeling on the part, I think, of virtually everybody in the Situation Room, that the Russians had flat out committed an aggression against an independent state.
The issue was, do we put in combat power or not? What you needed was ground troops if you're going to save Tbilisi.
Since the fall of the Soviet Union, the world's two biggest nuclear powers had never been so close to war. The conflict that almost led to war between two superpowers began to explode more than 2 years earlier. Mikhail Saakashvili, Georgia's west-leaning president, was heading for a showdown with Russia.
Message of Georgia to our great neighbor Russia is, enough is enough.
In the Georgian capital, he ordered the arrest of Russian officers for spying and publicly humiliated them. Russia cut ties with Georgia and deported Georgian workers.
От этого пострадала грузинская экономика. Признаю, что, к сожалению, пострадал и грузинский народ, граждане Грузии от этого. Но другого выхода после этого хамства просто у нас не было. Эти люди думают, что, находясь под крышей своих иностранных спонсоров, они могут чувствовать себя комфортно и в безопасности. Так ли это на самом деле?
To stop Putin going any further, the American Secretary of State came to Moscow.
I was not brought immediately to see President Putin, which had generally been the practice. I would land and I would go to meet with him, and this time they told me I needed to wait.
The Russian president was meeting his military and intelligence advisors.
Путин понимает, что ему надо уже заканчивать и идти встречаться с послом американским. Смотрит на часы, потом так я смотрю, он ехидно улыбнулся, так про себя. Говорит, слушайте, о чем мы будем срочно здесь заканчивать? Давайте такую, мизансцену разыграем.
It was 5 o'clock, 5:30, 6 o'clock, 6:30. Finally, about 7:30, they said, well, he's ready to see you now.
A car came to collect Rice, but it didn't take her to the Kremlin. Past the city's suburbs, she was sped into the countryside. Finally, Rice found herself at the door of an old hunting lodge.
I walked into this dark paneled room with the entire Russian national security establishment over a banquet table, just Bill Burns, our ambassador, and me.
Кондолиза, у нее мускул на лице не дрогнул, она очень выдержанный человек, Вот. Бернс так немножко, по-моему, растерялся.
And it was, a quite unusual circumstance. I mean, it wasn't the normal place to receive a foreign minister, let alone the American Secretary of State.
Ну, я там поздоровался. Все, кто знал их, тоже поздоровались, пошутили. Вот у нас Совет Безопасности, вот мы обсуждаем совершенно секретные вопросы. Вот у меня документы, разведывательные сводки совсекретные. Хочешь, Кондолиза, посмотреть? Вот, о чем тут мне ГРУ докладывают. Вот в таком шутливом.
It was Dmitry Medvedev's birthday, and President Putin said, "Oh, we thought you'd like to join us for the birthday party." So there we were, having the birthday party. After a while, I said to him, we have some work to do.
Президент Путин пригласил Кондолизу Райс и сопровождающих лиц пройти в соседнее помещение уже для переговоров. Пошел серьезный очень разговор.
The Secretary of State was finally able to get to the point of her visit: Putin's treatment of Georgia.
I said that President Bush had told me to come and say that if they did anything in Georgia, Russia, that would be a rupture in U.S.-Russian relations. And all of a sudden, President Putin stood up. And now I was seated, he was standing. And so I stood up too, reflexively. And so the two of us were standing there. And he said, "You tell the president that I'll do what I need to do." And it was pretty hard-edged.
There was no mistaking President Putin's point that if there were Georgian provocations that would cause a security problem, that, Russia would respond.
The Georgian crisis wasn't over yet, and Putin was determined to stop America encroaching on any of his other borders.
3, 2, 1, 0. On status attack.
Above all, Putin felt threatened by an American plan to put military hardware in Poland and the Czech Republic. Washington said it was to defend against long-range missiles from Iran. But Putin was convinced it was aimed at Russia's missiles.
Наши специалисты военные полагают, что эта система, конечно же, затронет территорию Российской Федерации вплоть до Уральских гор. Нам говорят, что система ПРО направлена на защиту от того, чего не существует. Вам не кажется, что это как минимум смешно? Но было бы смешно, если бы не было так грустно.
At a summit of world leaders in Germany, Bush braced himself for more of Putin's anger. But Putin was one step ahead of him.
I met with my Russian counterpart, Sergei Prohodka, and he signaled that President Putin had personally been engaged and thinking about missile defense cooperation and had some ideas, concrete ideas, that he wanted to share with the president.
Я ему действительно сказал, что приготовьтесь, будет интересная дискуссия.
And so I obviously informed the president, and with a smile he said, "Let's see what the man's got."
When the leaders met, Putin revealed a new, constructive approach to missile defense.
Мы размышляли, что если мы критикуем американцев за их план, но при этом признаем, что новые угрозы могут возникнуть, мы должны что-то предложить позитивное, конструктивное, содержательное.
Значит, первое предложение заключается в том, чтобы использовать арендуемую нами в Азербайджане радиолокационную станцию Габала.
He made some interesting suggestions. I told Vladimir we're looking forward to having up to my folks' place in Maine.
At the Bush family's summer home, the leaders obliged the press with a photo opportunity and some fish, then got down to business.
President Putin actually presented kind of a schematic about how U.S., European, and Russian assets might work together to provide missile defense.
Ручкой карандашом показал, что где может быть расположено, что это принесет американской стороне, что это принесет российской.
We thought, aha, we've got the breakthrough we've been looking for almost 15 years or so.
Bush seized on the opening.
The president said, "Look, let's take a clean sheet of paper. We can design a truly cooperative missile defense system protecting Europe, Russia, and the United States' interests in Europe.
Владимир Путин заметил, что, это подчеркнул особо, это, по сути дела, превратило бы нас в союзников, если бы мы вместе стали работать над такой системой.
The two leaders took to the cameras to herald a new era in US-Russian cooperation.
Here's the thing when you're dealing with a leader, you wonder whether or not he's telling you the truth or not. Do I trust him? Yeah, I trust him. He just laid out a vision. I think it's very sincere. I think it's innovative. I think it's strategic.
Putin had offered Bush a genuine opportunity to prove that missile defense wasn't aimed at Russia. But there was a catch.
Мы считаем, что в этом случае не будет никакой необходимости размещать ни новые объекты в Европе, имеется в виду в Чехии и в ударную группировку в Польше.
President Bush had no intention of giving up on the bases in Poland and the Czech Republic. So he told America's two most senior negotiators to square the circle.
The President promised, and we are here to act on that promise, that we would try and find ways to cooperate to the common good.
While we insisted that we were consulting with the Russians about this, the perception, I think, on President Putin's part was that we were just informing them of decisions that we intended to put into action. And, that produced a fair amount of resentment and suspicion on his side.
Мы ведь с вами можем когда-нибудь решить, что противоракетные системы можно разместить и на Луне. Но пока мы до этого доберемся, возможность договориться может быть утрачена в силу реализации вами собственных.
Putin questioned whether the Americans really needed a missile defense system.
He sort of passed me this piece of paper that showed the range arcs of Iranian missiles.
Есть ли возможности, или, как вот говорят по-английски, capabilities, которые позволяют говорить о том, что Иран завтра, в кавычках, запустит ракету? Нет, чепуха.
He was basically saying that their intelligence was that the Iranians couldn't have a missile that could hit Europe for years and years and years. And that's when I said, you need to get a new intelligence service.
Gates suggested a way forward.
I said we could offer to wait for the installation of the interceptors until the Iranians had flight tested a missile that could hit Europe.
The offer went down well. But the Russians feared that they would still end up as the Americans' target. And the Pentagon's PowerPoint presentation didn't persuade them.
Американские коллеги очень любят говорить такие слова: «Доверяй, но проверяй». Мы хотели бы контролировать, что происходит именно на месте там.
I thought that there were a lot of things we could offer in the way of transparency, in terms of giving them access. We could even have a more or less permanent Russian presence there, like arms inspectors.
Значит, детали, технические детали, вот такие детали, о которых мы говорили, как они будут жить, где будут получать заработную плату, как будет получать заработную плату. Разумеется, это не было. Речь шла об интересной идее.
All these measures that I talked about, I was just making up on the spot. If Condi and I agreed that we could do these things, then why not see if we could make some headway with Putin?
Владимир Путин заметил, что хотя это не является таким совместным уж проектом, о котором, собственно говоря, мы и вели речь, но эти предложения он оценил как направленные на учет наших реальных озабоченностей. И мы попросили, чтобы американская сторона положила эти предложения на бумагу.
I'm not sure how much consternation there was back in Washington when we reported what we'd offered.
Rice and Gates had gone too far for a powerful part of the Washington establishment.
I was doubtful that this actually indicated a Russian a desire to actually cooperate on missile defense. My view was a lot of what they were doing was tactically aimed at preventing us from moving forward on missile defense.
They wanted us not to put in any military infrastructure into territory that they regarded as, in some sense, if not theirs, at least with an asterisk, former property of Russia handled with caution.
There were several areas in which the interagency process here sanded off some of the sharp edges of the offers and made them less attractive.
The Americans put the offers in writing as Putin had asked, but dropped their original offer of a permanent Russian presence at the Czech and Polish sites. Instead, they proposed that Russian embassy attachés could occasionally visit the sites.
Бумагу мы получили где-то через месяц, в ноябре 2007 года. Ни одно из этих предложений в ней не содержалось.
Bush continued to say he wanted Putin's cooperation on missile defense. But the two countries were now coming into conflict on another front.
Good morning. Sunday, the people of Kosovo declared their independence. They have asked the United States for diplomatic recognition. And yesterday, the United States formally recognized Kosovo as a sovereign and independent nation.
By recognizing a breakaway state, Bush unintentionally reignited the conflict between his ally Georgia and Russia. At a regional gathering, Putin warned Georgia's leader that America had created a dangerous precedent.
Не просчитывают результатов того, что они делают. В конечном итоге это палка о двух концах, и вторая палка треснет их по башке когда-нибудь.
Georgia's president felt vulnerable.
We are small in size, and actually we are very close to Russia, and we are far from Europe. And this, if you look carefully, the geography, it was an ideal target for any revanchist Russian government.
Relations between Georgia and Russia had been tense since the fall of the Soviet Union. Two provinces of Georgia had rebelled, Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Backed by Russia, they remained outside Georgia's control. 3 years earlier, Saakashvili had set out to subdue the smaller of the two, South Ossetia. The rebels, armed and trained by Russia, fought back.
We really needed to, have further American presence with the Russians to somehow convince the Russians that, it wasn't in their interest because they wouldn't just listen to us.
Saakashvili went to see the then Secretary of State, Colin Powell.
He was young and somewhat impulsive, and his impulses sometimes caused him to go further than he should based on the situation he was in.
Are you going to be provoked by Russia?
Some of very crazy and outrageous things were said by some of the Russian politicians, like the fact that Georgia is infringing on their own sovereignty. I mean, since when does Russia own a piece of Georgia?
The Secretary of State knew this was not going to be an easy meeting.
We wanted to be supportive of him, but I had to make it clear to him that you may think this is in your vital national interest. We're not sure that it is, but it isn't in our vital national interest. So don't get yourself into a situation that may overwhelm you and think that we are going to race in to rescue you from any difficulties you get into. So be careful.
He told me, listen, son, you've got here a situation, but it's still not a crisis.
Well, what we're anxious to do is calm the situation down, remove tensions and the propensity for provocation, get back to dialogue. I'm staying in close touch with our Russian colleagues as well.
Мы посылали сигналы Вашингтону. Колин Пауэлл был человеком, который понимал все риски, сопряженные с подобного рода непредсказуемым агрессивным поведением.
Saakashvili pulled Georgian troops out of South Ossetia. But over the next 3 years, Georgia spent millions of American dollars on its military. In South Ossetia, Russians were appointed as ministers of defense, security, and interior, and even as prime minister. And Moscow offered Russian citizenship to anyone in the province who asked. In February 2008, Georgia applied for membership of NATO, the alliance created to defend the West against Russia.
ეს არის საჭირო იმისათვის, რომ საქართველოს ამ ძალიან რთულ რეგიონში, რისკით აღსავსე რეგიონში, სტრატეგიულად იყოს დაცული თავისი წილი უსაფრთხოების გარანტიები მიიღოს.
3 weeks later, he was in Washington again to win the president's support. He chose words straight out of Bush's own phrasebook.
What we are up to now is to implement this freedom agenda till the end, for the sake of our people, for the sake of our values, for the sake of what the United States means for all of us, because the U.S. is exporting idealism to the rest of the world.
He was terrific. He was on message. He came into the president with a message about the importance of recognizing that his legacy was building a democratic Georgia. This was music to our ears. This was the right message.
I believe Georgia benefits from being a part of NATO. And I told the president it's a message I'll be taking to Bucharest. Thank you all.
Bucharest would be the venue for the next NATO summit, where Georgia's bid would be discussed. Bush would have a formidable opponent, German Chancellor Angela Merkel. She insisted Georgia wasn't ready to join NATO, not least because of its conflict with Russia.
Länder, die selbst in regionale oder innere Konflikte verstrickt sind, können nicht aus meiner Sicht Mitglieder der NATO sein. Wir sind ein Bündnis zur Verteidigung der Sicherheit und nicht ein Bündnis, in dem einzelne Mitglieder vielleicht noch mit ihrer eigenen Sicherheit zu tun haben.
NATO members gathered at the palace built by Romania's former communist dictator. The foreign ministers were to meet that evening. The main items on the agenda were bids by Georgia and Ukraine to join the alliance, via what they all called a Membership Action Plan, or MAP. To grant MAP required the unanimous consent of all NATO members.
My impression was that some allies had made commitments to the Russians that that MAP would not be granted.
Manche wollten nicht hören, dass wir in der Region am Schwarzen Meer eine Konfliktsituation haben, bei der das Risiko bestand, dass die NATO unmittelbar dort hineingezogen wird.
The East Europeans were quite emotional, coming very close to saying to the Germans, you of all people shouldn't be standing in the way of these countries that suffered under tyranny, coming awfully close to saying thanks to what the Germans had done in the 1930s and the 1940s.
Es sind Sätze gefallen, wie ich sie nicht wieder hören möchte, dass diejenigen, die skeptisch waren gegenüber einer NATO-Erweiterung, in Vergleich gesetzt wurden mit der Haltung München 1938, absolut unpassend.
Such disputes were normally resolved by officials before the leaders met. The Americans decided to sort it out over breakfast with the key opponents of MAP, Germany and France.
At midnight, I'm making calls saying, guess what? You know, sorry to wake you up, but there's an extra meeting.
À 1h du matin, puis à 3h du matin, j'ai reçu des appels téléphoniques pour vérifier si j'avais bien compris quelle était l'heure du petit déjeuner, quel était l'endroit du petit déjeuner. À 7h du matin, nous étions rassemblés, mais c'était pas du tout un petit déjeuner amical à 4, c'était une forme de tribunal.
We argue that if we were to back down in the face of Russian pressure, and not give them MAP, that actually that in itself could be provocative by suggesting to the Russians that they could permanently keep Georgia and Ukraine out of NATO.
Si, en franchissant le pas du MAP, nous allions créer une nouvelle guerre froide, une nouvelle cassure de l'Europe. Et donc, pour nous, c'était no surrender.
As the formalities of the leaders' session got underway, frantic efforts continued around them to broker a compromise.
Es waren wirkliche Vorhänge in diesem Saal, hinter denen die Mitarbeiter in unterschiedlichen Konstellationen zusammensaßen, zusammenstanden.
Steve Hadley and I went back behind the curtain, and I said, you know, we'd better get the Poles involved in this, because actually I was hoping that Roddick would carry the East Europeans if we and the Germans came to some conclusion.
The Germans were not opposing the idea of these two countries eventually joining NATO. They just didn't want to start the process quite yet.
We got to some language that was more or less workable. It wasn't perfect, but it was close enough. It was going to punt to the foreign ministers to make a decision in December, and so it was enough from our point of view.
Postponing a decision for 8 months satisfied Bush and Merkel, but not the former Soviet satellites.
The Eastern and Central Europeans went ballistic. They thought that the document was a capitulation to Russian pressure and Russian veto, and they wanted changes to be made.
The Polish president said, we want MAP today, not in December, we want it today. And I thought, oh my goodness, something has fallen apart here.
All the foreign ministers get up and go to the back of the room. And then Angela Merkel gets up from her chair and goes to the back and sits down at a table in the midst of these gray-haired men.
And that's when Merkel herself grabbed the pen.
The German Chancellor suggested a compromise.
Much to my surprise, when I went back, it said, Georgia and Ukraine will become members of NATO. I thought, well, this is a pretty good deal. And I went to the president and I said, take it.
Germany and France would get what they wanted, no membership action plan. In return, Georgia would be promised full NATO membership at a later date.
And it results in Gordon Brown leaning over to President Bush and saying, I know we didn't give Georgia and Ukraine MAP, but I'm not sure we didn't just make them members.
But it was a hollow victory. The prospective members were given no clue how long they would have to wait. Within weeks of the NATO summit, Russia upped its support for Georgia's separatist provinces, South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Georgia flew drones over the region to monitor Russian troop movements. Russian fighters shot them down. Russian peacekeepers were caught transporting arms to the separatists. And in May, Russia sent specialist troops into Abkhazia to repair a disused railroad.
The only strategic reason to restore railroad would be if you would want to transport heavy equipment, that is to say tanks. And tanks are assault weapons.
But there was a glimmer of hope for the Georgian president. Vladimir Putin, after 8 years as president, stood down and became prime minister.
Здравствуйте, товарищи!
With the new president, Dmitry Medvedev, came the chance for a fresh start.
На самом деле очень рад с вами так воочию встретиться.
Но я просто могу вас заверить, как новый президент Российской Федерации, что я сделаю все для того, чтобы вы постарались найти какие-то компромиссы, которые устроят всех, которые в конечном счете способствовали бы реинтеграции пространства Грузии.
Я думаю, что нерешаемых вопросов нет. Нерешенных много, нерешаемых нет.
But the Russians immediately raised a sticking point. They wanted a commitment that Georgia would never use force in the disputed provinces.
Мимо первого шага было бы крайне важно, чтобы грузинская сторона заключила договоренность о неприменении сил.
They told us, you signed documents with the separatists, with Russia as a guarantor. We told them, look, we are willing to sign any commitment under international guarantees, which are not Russian guarantees, because it's like giving a fox a mandate to guard a chicken house.
The last time Georgia signed an agreement with Russia as guarantor, 2,000 Russian troops arrived as peacekeepers in the disputed provinces. 14 years later, they were still there. Saakashvili suggested a summit to discuss a new plan for one of the provinces, Abkhazia. The Russian troops would pull back a few miles, but they would retain control of most of the territory. Medvedev replied that Saakashvili must sign a no-use-of-force pledge first. At the start of July, both presidents were in Kazakhstan for the birthday party of its president. Saakashvili was determined to press his plan.
During the day, I tried to interact with Medvedev, but, official protocol was making sure that we don't get really in touch. We were kind of keeping us apart.
Его трудно избегать, потому что он липкий. Значит, и если он хочет пристать, то он пристанет как следует. Он ко мне подходил несколько раз. Мы с ним разговаривали. Я отлично это помню. Сидя в автобусе, гуляя там по какому-то парку.
In the evening, their host took them to a nightclub.
Мы потом пошли попить вечером чайку и по бокалу вина. Значит, и даже там мы сидели с ним на каком-то диванчике.
So I had the opportunity to tell him, look, we are really getting into a precarious situation. I mean, things are escalating.
Он начал перечислять свои какие-то сложности или свое там видение ситуации. Я ему сказал о российском видении. Я ему сказал, приезжайте в Россию. Он сказал, хорошо.
But Medvedev's invitation carried the same conditions as before. Sign a no-use-of-force pledge first.
And he said, I'm so pleased to be with you here. And we are listening to the same music. We like the same social environment. We are at ease with each other. But back in Moscow, there are different rules of game.
Diplomacy stalled, and the situation on the ground worsened as Georgians and separatists shelled each other.
The
Russian foreign minister turned to Georgia's protector, America.
Мы говорили, Саакашвили играет с огнем. Удержите его от авантюры очередной. Убедите его подписать соглашение о неприменении сил.
I said that their behavior was making it very difficult for him in terms of domestic audiences to sign a no-use-of-force pledge. I mean, after all, they were moving railway troops in. They'd been doing that for about 4 months to, quote, construct the railway.
Конди мне сказала однажды, Сергей, не волнуйся, он хочет в НАТО. Он прекрасно знает, что если он применит силу, он может забыть про НАТО.
It will be another generation before they are in NATO if they use force.
Rice knew her confident prediction might be proved wrong unless she got more involved. She flew to the Georgian capital with a mission that would test her diplomatic powers to the limit.
Well, hello, how are you? Good to see you. Good to see you. Great. I know her. Yes, how are you?
We have like 6 or 7.
I can remember looking out over Tbilisi as Saakashvili pointed out different things that were being built and churches that were being restored and so forth.
The whole Georgia is in a big renovation. Here there were lots of very ugly buildings.
Like we really want to make it a very special place.
Saakashvili told Rice that the Russians would soon take permanent control of Abkhazia and South Ossetia.
I said to Condi, look, Condi, we are in a precarious situation. We are basically getting into a downward spiral, which is getting us to an absolute oblivion. We really can get to the worst case scenario. And here, as it looks, it doesn't look promising on the Russian side.
I said, Mr. President, you need to sign this no use of force pledge. And he said, why would I do that? I will get nothing for it.
Condi Rice kept repeating, I know the Russians, she would say, they will not go to war. And we always said, we hope you're right. We hope you know them better than we do.
They were pleading, please, Secretary of State, what happens if Russia continues to expand its military expansion in the territory of Georgia? What if Russia expands the scope of its attacks over the civilians?
I said, rely on the international community to support you and defend you, because I kept repeating, if you engage Russian forces, you will lose.
To encourage Saakashvili to sign the No Use of Force pledge, Rice offered American and European participation in peace talks.
And she said, we'll go bring it to UN General Assembly. End of September, we'll get together Lavrov and other foreign ministers from EU countries, and we'll have high-level talks on how to create some kind of venue for things to be discussed.
He's no fool. Saakashvili understood her logic. He sort of tilted his head, thought, like 10 seconds silent, and said, all right, okay, I'm in.
Rice had won the diplomatic battle. But in the press conference the following morning, she said something that invited misunderstanding.
We take very, very strongly our obligation to help our allies defend themselves, and no one should be confused about that. It was very important for the Georgians to know that if they did the difficult things, the United States would stand by them if the Russians didn't stand by their obligations. And I absolutely, deliberately, in front of the press, said that the United States would stand by Georgia.
The parties agreed to meet in 2 months' time. They all went on their summer breaks. Saakashvili departed for a health farm in Italy, and Medvedev took a cruise on Russia's Volga River. But at the end of July, Ossetians and Georgians resumed sniping and shelling each other.
Стороны начали применять огонь боевых машин пехоты. В частности, миротворческий контингент Грузии, батальон миротворческого контингента, стал открыто выступать на стороне спецназа МВД, и они стали применять огонь непосредственно этих боевых машин. Стороны начали применять огонь минометов. Скажу, что ожесточенность все больше и больше нарастала.
The Russian and American diplomats who looked after the region were confident they could handle it.
I call Karasin, who was both concerned and, to listen to him, willing to be helpful.
Мы хорошо понимали, что наши американские коллеги имеют особый вес в отношениях с тбилисским руководством. Мы просто хотели, чтобы подсказать им или призвать их к тому, чтобы они оказали отрезвляющее воздействие. И надо сказать, что Дэниел обещал это сделать.
He said he would work with the South Ossetians, so this was what I considered to be a constructive call. And on Monday, I briefed Rice that there was a flare-up. The Russians say they'll take care of it, so we're watching it.
The Russians sent more peacekeeping troops into South Ossetia. And just north of the border, 12,000 Russian troops were poised, battle-ready. On the 7th of August, Georgia mobilized its army. Russia sent an ambassador, Yuri Popov, to talk to Georgia's peace negotiator. They were due to meet in the heart of South Ossetia, but the Russian didn't show up.
ველოდები პოპოვს, რომელიც არ ჩანს. ურეკავ პოპოვს ვეკითხები, სადა ვარ, გზაში ვარ, ოღონდ დამეშვა საბურავი. თქვარი, გამოცვალე საბურავის გამოცვალეს რა უნდა? არა, სათადარიგო საბურავის დაშვებულია. ხლა მე შევთავაზე ჩვენ მანქანას გამოგიგზავნით, მეთქი, არა, საელჩოს მანქანა ჩავამიყვანს.
So the Georgian turned to the Russian commander of the peacekeepers.
У меня состоялась с ним встреча, где-то около часа мы с ним разговаривали. Я проинформировал о той ситуации, которая складывается в зоне конфликта. Сказал, что все, мы практически у порога войны. И в этом есть большая заслуга Грузии. И он, как сопредседатель, несет тоже личную ответственность за это.
მე მას უთხარი, რომ ჩემი თვალით ვნახე, რომ ნასრული ჭოროები ქართული სოფლების მიმართულებით მოდიოდა თქვენი მხრიდან, მაგრამ რატო არ აჩერებთ? მაშინ კულახმეტად თქვა, რომ იცი რა, მე ამათ ვერ ვაკონტროლებ. ანუ მე არანაირი კონტროლი ამ ცხინვალის რეჟიმისა აღარ შემიძლია.
Я сказал, что единственный способ, который я вижу, что возможность, чтобы грузинская сторона взяла на себя односторонние обязательства и практически выполнила их, это прекратило ведение огня. Он сказал, попробуем.
რამდენიმე საათის წინ გავეცე ბრძანება, ძალიან მტკივნეული გაბრძანება, როგორც უმაღლესმა თავარსარდალმა, რომ არც ერთმა ქართულმა შენაერთმა, არც ერთმა ჩვენი კონტროლის ქვეშ ყოფმა პოლიციურმა და სხვა შენაერთმა არ გახსნა საფასუხო ცეცხლი.
But Saakashvili's forces continued to mobilize. The Russian envoy, Yuri Popov, now had 4 good tires and was on the road inside Georgia.
Попов позвонил по телефону, по открытой связи, сказал следующее: Григорий Борисович, мимо меня идут больше 30 транспортов с военными, со спецназом, идет боевая техника, я думаю, что они начнут войну.
There was already Russian presence, there was already annexation process underway, de facto, on the ground. And I don't know whether it crossed red, yellow, or green lines, but it certainly crossed every line of civilized behavior. And, we had no other way but to act.
ჩვენ ვერ მივცემდით საკუთარ თავს იმის უფლებას, რომ აი ესე არაფრის კეთებით ბოლომდე მიყვანის შესაძლებლობა მიგვეცა მხოლოდ იმიტომ, რომ ამ ხალხის ჩახოცვის ყურებით და არაფრის კეთებით დაგვემტკიცებინა კიდევ ერთხელ, რომ ჩვენ არ გვინდოდა საომარი მოქმედებებით.
Eka called me and said that they were going to establish constitutional authority over South Ossetia. Well, what I understood was that they were moving in. I recall telling her to be careful. Your strongest asset is the perception that you're the victim in this situation, and don't lose that.
At 10:30 that evening, Saakashvili received reports that Georgian villages had come under fire. An hour later, he picked up the phone.
We thought that, at least we would win some time, hold back Russians for some time, and hopefully international community would wake up and basically, with concentrated efforts, we would get some kind of reversal.
ამ კონფრონტაციის შემდეგ ჩვენ ისრაელი ვიქნებით თუ პალესტინა.
საქართველოს ძალოვან სტრუქტურებმა გადაწყვიტა კონსტიტუციური წესრიგი აღადგინოს მთელ რეგიონში.
The Russian president was woken by a phone call.
Мне позвонил министр обороны и сказал, что наш грузинский сосед начал активные боевые действия. Я честно скажу, абсолютно предельно откровенно, я вначале очень засомневался. Я говорю, знаешь, надо проверить. Он что, совсем сумасшедший, сбрендил, что ли? Ну, может быть, это просто провокация какая-то. Он испытывает на прочность этих осетин, там, значит, и пытается что-то, так сказать, там нам показать.
After a night of rocketing and shelling in which civilians and soldiers were killed, Georgia's troops moved on the South Ossetian capital. Russian peacekeepers were among the casualties.
Что я должен сделать? Я сказал, открывайте ответный огонь на поражение.
Мы не допустим безнаказанной гибели наших соотечественников. Виновные понесут заслуженное наказание.
For the first time in 3 decades, Russian tanks advanced into a neighboring country. Georgia's armed forces were now at war with one of the largest militaries in the world. In Beijing, everyone was celebrating the Olympic spirit of a peaceful and better world. Among the leaders arriving for the opening ceremony was Vladimir Putin. French President Nicolas Sarkozy introduced him to his son Louis, then attempted some impromptu diplomacy.
Il a dit au président Poutine, écoute, je suis actuellement en présidence de l'Union européenne, je suis prêt à tout faire au nom de l'Union européenne pour éviter une guerre qui serait une catastrophe à la fois pour la Russie, pour l'Europe, pour l'avenir de la coopération entre la Russie et l'Europe. Mais Vladimir, pour cela, il faut que tu me donnes 48 heures. Réponse, niet. Alors, le président Sarkozy a dit, mais Vladimir, tu te rends compte de ce qui est en jeu. Écoute, au moins, donne-moi 24 heures. Niet. Impossible. Alors, le président de la République lui a dit, mais écoute, donne-moi cette nuit. Niet.
Russia's forces were already pushing the Georgians back in South Ossetia. Their air force now set out to destroy Georgia's defenses and targeted the capital itself. On the second day of the war, they flew 120 bombing sorties.
Можно, конечно, было выдавить и остановиться. Но что мы слышали? Мы сейчас, так сказать, отойдем на какие-то прежние порядки. Американские друзья и некоторые другие нам помогут довооружиться, восстановить самолеты, еще что-то. И мы с удвоенной энергией продолжим ту операцию, которая была. Значит, именно поэтому задача была в том, чтобы в тот момент демонтировать, разрушить военную машину Грузии.
The American Secretary of State phoned Moscow to demand its army call a halt. The Russian foreign minister responded with a tough condition.
He said, Misha Saakashvili has to go. And I said, Sergei, the American Secretary of State and the Russian foreign minister do not have a private conversation about overthrowing a democratically elected president.
Единственное, что я сказал о Кондолизе Райс в отношении персоны Михаила Саакашвили, что мы с ним больше дела иметь не будем никогда. И эта позиция остается в силе.
I think it's quite clear that the Russians intended to use this conflict to depose Saakashvili. I felt that the best guarantee that they couldn't would be to make public their demand that he go.
Rice called America's ambassador at the United Nations and told him to reveal Lavrov's words to the Security Council.
In that conversation, Foreign Minister Lavrov told U.S. Secretary of State Rice that the democratically elected president of Georgia, and I quote, Saakashvili must go, end of quote. This is completely unacceptable and crosses a line.
Говорить на весь мир о том, что ты обсуждал со своим партнером, это, в любом случае, это из практики не нашей дипломатии и не из практики дипломатии цивилизованной.
Russian forces were now deep inside Georgia.
Let's move away.
Saakashvili was in the town of Gori, near his army's headquarters as the Russians closed in. The next day, the Russians advanced to within 40 miles of the Georgian capital Tbilisi. Saakashvili rang Washington for help. President Bush convened his national security team.
There was a clear feeling on the part, I think, of virtually everybody in the Situation Room that the Russians had flat out committed an aggression against an independent state, and were proceeding to dismember it.
There was a little bit of chest beating around the table about what we would do, and we had to keep the Russians from doing this and talk about how we could signal the Russians militarily that this would be a foolhardy thing to do.
The issue was, do we put in combat power or not? What you needed was ground troops if you're going to save Tbilisi.
Steve Hadley's not somebody who usually roils the waters very much, but I think he decided that this was getting a bit out of control. And so he said, I just want to ask that we step back for a moment and recognize that if we are in fact prepared to start signaling the Russians that we will do something militarily if they do indeed move to Tbilisi, then we're on the hook to do it.
I was pretty adamant, and I think Secretary Rice was as well, that we not give weapons assistance to Saakashvili. My feeling at the time was that the Russians had baited a trap, and Saakashvili had walked right into it. And so they were both culpable.
Saakashvili's gamble had failed. The Americans were not prepared to risk war with the world's second nuclear power. The president of France now took center stage.
Саркози сделал очень добрую вещь. Он позвонил мне и говорит, слушай, вот там у вас конфликт, давай я прилечу. Я говорю, ну, я буду рад тебя видеть.
Before he arrived, President Sarkozy had sent the Russians a draft ceasefire agreement.
Et nous nous sommes immédiatement rendus dans une salle où le président Medvedev avait sous les yeux une carte militaire de la Géorgie.
Il faut faire un calendrier rapide pour que chacun revienne sur les positions d'avant la crise.
Мы сейчас можем обсудить вопросы окончательного урегулирования проблемы при обеспечении, как мы уже и говорили, двух условий. Это возвращение всех грузинских войск на исходные позиции дислокации, демилитаризация частичная этих образований воинских.
У французов был свой вариант документа. Мы немножко его подкорректировали.
Not so little. He changed the first sentence, Georgian and Russian forces will withdraw fully. With a deletion, it now read, Georgian forces will withdraw fully.
Il changeait complètement la logique. Il ne s'agissait pas d'un arrêt des hostilités, du retrait des forces, etc. Il s'agissait en réalité d'imposer une sorte de diktat à la Géorgie.
Sarkozy threatened to leave unless the Russians took the negotiations seriously.
La Russie doit mettre sa puissance au service de la paix.
Жесткую, очень жесткую, но заинтересованную и уважительную в отношении интересов Российской Fédération.
Le président Sarkozy a dit, écoutez, voilà, c'est simple, j'ai un texte, on tourne en rond, vous refusez nos formules, maintenant c'est moi qui prends la plume et vous me dites oui ou non. Alors, premièrement, je reprends le texte, les parties au conflit s'engagent à ne pas recourir à la force. Êtes-vous d'accord, oui ou non? Oui.
The French president wrote out 4 further clauses on the ending of hostilities, the withdrawal of Russian and Georgian forces, and additional security measures Russia could take on the ground. And the Russians insisted on a 6th clause, saying that the independence of the disputed territories had to be on the agenda.
И 6. Начало международного обсуждения вопросов будущего статуса Южной Осетии и Абхазии.
Sarkozy flew straight to Georgia. There, President Saakashvili was holding a public rally to show defiance to Russia and prove he still had popular support. Then he met the travel-weary French president. Saakashvili said that Clause 6 would lose Georgia the two disputed provinces forever. He made a plea to Sarkozy in French.
I told him, si je signe ce papier qui indique que la question de l'intégrité territoriale reste ouverte et peut-être peuvent être débattées ou disputées plus tard, l'histoire n'a jamais justifié ça, n'importe quelle sont la porte entre toi et moi.
Il lui a dit, vous ne devez vous faire aucune illusion. Si cet accord n'est pas approuvé par les deux côtés, eh bien, les hostilités reprendront demain matin. Combien de forces américaines seront là pour bloquer l'avance des tanks russes?
Saakashvili reluctantly agreed, on condition that there be no talks on the future status of Abkhazia or South Ossetia. It was still a bitter defeat for Georgians, but Sarkozy helped Saakashvili to save face.
L'intégrité territoriale de la Géorgie me semble d'ailleurs garantie par l'esprit de ce texte.
Merci.
Russia had said its offensive was now over, but the next morning they appeared to tighten their stranglehold on Georgia.
This is the main road out of Gori, and coming up it is a Russian column. We think they're moving to a Georgian base, but what they are doing is pushing further into Georgia.
The President and I were talking about this. The Russians weren't stopping. Were they really going for Tbilisi? What were they doing in Gori? And we needed somehow to send a stronger signal.
Good morning. I've also directed Secretary of Defense Bob Gates to begin a humanitarian mission to the people of Georgia headed by the United States military. This mission will be vigorous and ongoing.
We wanted to use the military aircraft to let the Russians know that we were serious about them not going any further toward Tbilisi or toward overrunning the rest of Georgia.
The Russians stopped, but their forces would remain in Saakashvili's country.
Он вообще должен быть признателен мне, что в какой-то момент я просто остановил войска. Если бы они вошли в Тбилиси, то, скорее всего, в настоящий момент в Грузии был бы другой президент.
Russia had torn apart an American ally, and Washington was forced to accept it. America's attempts to expand its influence in Russia's backyard had been checked.
Я подписал указы о признании Российской Федерации независимости Южной Осетии и независимости Абхазии.
But the independence of Georgia's disputed territories was recognized by only 3 other countries: Venezuela, Nicaragua, and the tiny Pacific island of Nauru. Standing alone was a price Russia was prepared to pay.
Meet the children of the revolution in Egypt, here on BBC HD at 7 o'clock tomorrow. But next tonight, though, comedy with Roger and Val.